Benvenuto alla Cappella degli Scrovegni. Welcome to the Scrovegni Chapel, home to the world-famous Giotto fresco cycles, one of the indisputed masterpieces in the history of Western art. Before we enter the chapel, let us pause to gain some insight into the chapel's history and patron. The Scrovegni Chapel is often referred to as the Arena Chapel, a reference to its construction on the site of a 1st century AD Roman amphitheater. As you stand in front of the chapel, notice how the facade has been built to align with the remnants of the amphitheater wall, which still delineates the elliptical shape of this ancient arena. Construction on the chapel itself began in the year 1302, almost immediately after Enrico Scrovegni was granted permission to build a church on this site, which he had purchased from the city of Padua in the year 1300. Within 5 years of his purchase, Scrovegni had overseen the construction of an extensive compound consisting of the chapel, gardens, a substantial piazza, and a palace which had been located to the north of the chapel until its demolition in 1827. The chapel was dedicated on March 25, 1305, the feast of the Annunciation of the Virgin, and was accordingly dedicated to Santa Maria Annunziata, or Saint Mary of the Annunciation. The patron, Enrico Scrovegni, was one of the wealthiest men in Padua, but lacked a noble lineage. His family's fortune had been made in money lending, for which his father, Reginaldo Scrovegni, had earned a notorious reputation as a usurer, for which crime Dante would condemn him to his 7th circle of hell among other usurers from Florence and Padua. Usury, or the practice of lending money at high interest, was viewed by the Catholic Church as a mortal sin, because it was both a sin against justice, akin to theft, and also a sin against nature, for charging interest on a loaned sum was forcing something inherently sterile or infertile, money, to breed. While Enrico himself condemned the practice of usury, there is evidence that concern over his own spiritual well-being, and that of his father, who died in the same year Enrico purchased the arena, was the impetus that prompted him to undertake the construction and decoration of a chapel as means to confess his sins and offer restitution in order to earn forgiveness. This is a theme which will resurface in our examination of Giotto's decorative program in the chapel's interior. Let us now enter the chapel. We enter a door on the north wall of the chapel, a portal which would have originally linked this sacred space via covered walkway to the palace next door. Once inside, take a moment to absorb your surroundings. The frescoes covering every inch of the paintable surface, reaching from the tops of the choir stalls to the barrel vault overhead, painted to mimic a starry sky. If you pull yourself away from the frescoes for a moment, you will notice how very simple an interior space this is. Little more than a shell of blank walls and devoid of any architectural interest, this chapel is an anomaly when compared to similar structures of this time period in Italy. This simplicity may be evidence of the artist's involvement in the chapel's design, as the blank walls, uninterrupted by columns, pilasters, niches, or any other architectural embellishment, are perfectly conducive to the display of a frescoed narrative program. Giotto's primary intention in his decoration was to tell a story. Turn your attention now to the south wall of the chapel, the long wall with the windows. Giotto's narrative is arranged around the walls in 3 bands, always proceeding from left to right, beginning on the south wall, wrapping around the chapel to end directly behind you on the north wall. The topmost register tells the story of the Virgin's parents and the early life of the Virgin, stories which are not found in the New Testament but would have been known through Apocrypha and other popular writings such as the Golden Legend. This cycle includes such scenes as the meeting at the Golden Gate, in which the previously barren couple Joachim and Anne embrace after St. Anne discovers she is pregnant with the Virgin Mary, the birth of the Virgin, and the presentation of the Virgin in the temple. The middle and lower registers of the chapel illustrate the life and passion of the Christ, which among them include the adoration of the Magi, the massacre of the innocents, the baptism of Christ by John the Baptist, the entry into Jerusalem, and the crucifixion, the lamentation, and the resurrection. Beneath these narratives on the two long side walls, Giotto has painted 7 virtues on the south and 7 vices on the north. The 7 virtues Giotto includes are the 3 theological virtues, hope, charity, and faith, and the 4 cardinal virtues, justice, temperance, fortitude, and prudence. The corresponding vices are not the 7 deadly sins, but instead are the inverse of the virtues. They include despair, envy, infidelity, injustice, wrath, inconstancy, and folly. When you have finished exploring the pairings of virtue and vice, turn your attention to the east end of the chapel, where the altar is located. This end of the chapel is dominated by a grand triumphal arch which divides the chancel from the nave of the chapel, and whose top portion is decorated by a scene of the Annunciation. At the very top, God the Father dispatches the angel Gabriel to announce to the Virgin that she will conceive the Christ child, and below, on either side of the arch, the ensuing conversation is depicted. Gabriel on the left, and the Virgin Mary on the right. Below the Annunciation is a seemingly incongruous pair of scenes that are nevertheless linked by visual clues. On the left, below the angel Gabriel, is a scene of the pact, or bribing of Judas, the moment when Judas is paid 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus to the priests in Jerusalem. On the right is the scene of the visitation between the Virgin Mary, pregnant with the Christ child, and her cousin, Elizabeth, pregnant with John the Baptist. Both scenes feature 4 figures arranged in 2 pairs, the central pair of which wears red and yellow, and a 5th, more removed figure. On the right of each scene is a structure with arched doorways and a flat roof, and the placement of the money bag at Judas's abdomen seems to echo the pregnancy of the women. Contemporary viewers would have understood these scenes as antitheses to one another. 2 men undoing salvation, juxtaposed with 2 women providing for it. Monetary profit, juxtaposed with spiritual profit, and finally, sterile coin, juxtaposed with fertile womb. While the product of the visitation is life, Christ's life and thus salvation, the result of the pact of Judas is death, Judas's suicide, and eternal damnation. This theme is continued on the rear west wall. Turn around and walk towards this end of the chapel. Here, high on the wall above the doors, is Giotto's depiction of the Last Judgment, closure to the divine intercession first suggested in the Annunciation scene directly opposite on the altar side. Christ, radiant and lofty, is seated in judgment, sending the saved to his right and the damned to the monstrous devil in the depths of hell on his left. On one side of this divide is the kneeling, devout patron, Enrico Scrovegni, and across from him, on the side of the damned, is the hanging, eviscerated traitor Judas. Above Judas, 3 sinners hang from the strings of their money bags, a punishment often afforded to usurers in descriptions of hell. Aside from its connection to greed, usury during the Middle Ages was often conceived as a kind of unnatural fertility, or paralleled with aberrant sexuality, which explains, for example, why usurers and sodomites share the same circle of hell in Dante's Inferno. Here, in Giotto's illustration of hell, we find many instances of perverse fertility. Judas' disembowelment can be read as a gruesome inversion of childbirth, while a sinner emerging from what can only be described as Satan's womb also functions as a parody of this process. There are also many instances of sinners suffering particularly graphic sexual tortures. A man and a woman hang by their genitals. A green monster gnaws on a man's penis. And a black demon grabs another man's genitals with pincers. In contrast, a closer examination of the saved side of the judgment scene reveals an allusion to positive fecundity, very often associated with spiritual development, as below Scrovegni's feet, 10 diminutive nude figures emerge from fissures in the earth, symbolically reborn into their new spiritual lives. Enrico Scrovegni himself offers Christ a tiny version of this very chapel, in a way, a product of his own economic fertility. In this single gesture, Scrovegni makes amends for the actual or perceived sins of his family by handing back the ill-gotten gains of usury to the church in the form of this chapel. But as Scrovegni is positioned decidedly on the side of the saved, with privileged access to the cross, he is also expressing confidence in the fact of his own salvation, which was ensured through the construction of the chapel. Yet it is only in the examination of Giotto's fresco program that the function of the chapel, as confession of wrongs and as an act of recompense, becomes apparent. So concludes this audio tour of the Scrovegni Chapel. Please enjoy the rest of your time in the chapel and the remainder of your stay in Padua.